Hello, everyone. I'm back. It's a pleasure to be with you again on this Thursday afternoon, January 7th, 3 p.m. So that's what time it is, wherever you're at.
Unless you're in another time zone.
Unless you're in another time
like
zone.
one of all the other time zones around the whole world.
Yeah, exactly.
23.
But we all know there's one time zone that truly matters. That's the Pacific time zone, right? I don't actually mean that. It doesn't
West Coast is the best coast.
West Coast, best coast. Oh man, it feels good to be with you here in Studio A of Turner Christian Church. I have just now called this room Studio A, so that's what it's now dubbed.
Yeah.
So, if you ever
You
hear,
could have picked any letter you want because it's our only studio.
Well, I kind of thought first studio, A studio, right?
There you go.
Anyway, we are kicking off this new year of deleted scenes with a new series that Pastor Matt is introducing us to, and that is called The Eyewitnesses. And we're kind of going through the eyewitnesses that the gospel accounts are kind of written about. Their stories. Their stories of Jesus and what they experienced with that. And so we had kind of a introductory sermon on the eyewitnesses this last Sunday. Man, sometimes you just forget to do things. I'm Pastor Jack.
I'm Pastor Matt. He's the associate pastor here.
Yeah.
I'm the senior pastor here.
Yep.
At Turner Christian Church.
Yeah.
Which is in the Pacific time zone. Did we cover that one?
Yeah, we did cover that. I think that was pretty well covered too.
Okay.
So, man, yeah. All right. And so here's what we're going to be doing today. If you are joining us for the first time or one of your first times here, I have several questions for Pastor Matt, but you can also ask him questions by commenting whatever they may be in the comments section below, and we will get to those during the live broadcast. So, yeah, I have several questions for you.
Yeah. I'm pretty excited because we're getting into some really some questions that people get really interested in and can sometimes be controversial.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I'm excited to dig in.
I feel like some of these topics are those that they aren't talked about often unless someone has a specific question about them.
Or they've recently read the Da Vinci Code.
Or that, too.
Yeah.
That was one of those things where I feel like I was like thinking about watching the movie The Da Vinci Code. My mom was like, "Don't watch it. It's weird." I was like, "Okay," and I just never watched it.
Yeah.
And I kind of figured out what it's about, and I still just haven't watched it because I'm not really interested in it. Anyway.
Yeah.
But
the movie was better than the book.
Was it?
Yeah.
Well, who was the main actor in that?
Come on.
Tom Hanks?
Tom Hanks.
Yeah, Tom Hanks.
Tom Hanks.
That's the only reason I've ever been like, oh, maybe I'll watch it is because of Tom Hanks.
The prequel is better.
Okay.
It's not great, but it's better because it doesn't get into his bad scholarship. But that's a whole other thing.
Bad scholarship. Woohoo, that's fun.
Yes.
Well, without further ado, let's get into the questions so we don't take up too much of your Thursday afternoon. So my first question for you is you kind of talked a little bit about how, there were different kind of ideas that you threw out there as maybe kind of being incorrect as to how the Gospels were written. And one of those was that the Holy Spirit kind of took over the bodies of the authors and wrote it.
Mm-hmm.
But that wouldn't explain the differences in the Gospels. Because then the Holy Spirit would have purposely put those differences in there,
mm-hmm.
right? And so my first question kind of comes from this idea that there are differences between them because they're written by different guys. What could you say to the idea of different emphasis that the different authors put on their gospel record?
So it's well known anytime you read anything about the Gospels, people will talk about the different natures of them, how they're different from each other. As far as we can tell, the Gospel of Mark was written first. And it's the shortest. It's the most cut and dry, to the point, not a lot of extras. It has the least teachings. It's very active. It uses the word immediately as a transition a lot. So they're constantly rushing around. Immediately they went there, and then immediately they went there. Actually, we'll probably talk about this at some point, but in the sermon series, but it shows, tradition says that it was based on the eyewitness account of Peter, and an analysis of the text actually bears that out. Peter is mentioned way more than any other character other than Jesus in the story. He's the first apostle, or the first disciple mentioned, the last disciple mentioned. There's a lot of indicators that it came from Peter. Then you've got Matthew, who seems to have taken Mark and added in a lot of Old Testament connections and a lot of things that would make sense to a Jewish audience. And so a lot of scholars believe that Matthew wrote his gospel specifically to convince Jews that Jesus was the Messiah that they were waiting for. Luke has a different character where he also took Mark, and there's some things he has in common with Matthew that aren't in Mark. We're not quite sure about how that happened. That's where the theory of the Q document comes from, which is a whole other thing. But Luke really seems invested in telling the story as fully as he can, and he really wants to tell stories of individuals who encountered Jesus. So you get a lot of healing, a lot more healing stories, and you get a lot more of Jesus' emotional life. And he just seems to have told the fullest story, which makes sense with his introduction, where he says that he tried to talk to everybody and put together a full story. John is really fascinating to me the more I study about it, because what seems to have happened is that John looked at the other Gospels and said, that's great, but you guys missed some really important stuff that I saw. And so he tells almost a whole other set of stories. There are very few things that happen in John that also happen in the other Gospels. One of them is the feeding of the 5,000, and then the events around Jesus' death and resurrection. But my understanding, what I've seen, is that it seems to be because John, I don't believe that the John who wrote the Gospel of John was the John who was one of the 12. He was, signs indicate from the text that he was a different disciple named John who lived in Jerusalem. And he was probably the host of the Last Supper. He was probably, and it's very possible, like when Jesus talks to Nicodemus, that they're doing that at John's house. John's house seems to be where Jesus stayed when he came to Jerusalem. And so he has access to other stories that the disciples didn't have. So he adds a whole other set of memories. When you actually try and explain the differences between the Gospels, it makes way more sense that different people had different material and different perspectives than to say that the Holy Spirit decided to make 4 attempts and have 4 completely different results.
Yeah. So my next question kind of comes from this, the introductory verses that you read yesterday. It seems like someone has kind of name dropped really quickly in there and then kind of gone away from a little bit.
Yes.
And then you kind of covered a little bit about him. But I'm just wondering, who actually is Theophilus, and why did Luke choose to write it to him specifically?
So that is an excellent question, and there are 2 possible answers. Answer number 1 is Theophilus is a Christian that Luke knows somewhere, and probably, most likely, based on the way things were written, Theophilus the way things were written back then, Theophilus would have been a rich Christian who was capable of paying Luke, like paying for Luke's expenses while he did this. So he would have been his patron. And it was very common for a person, even if you were going to write a book that was for everybody, you would address it to the person who paid the bills so you could actually write it. So it's possible that he wrote it to a wealthy Christian. But the funny thing is, Theophilus means God lover, or lover of God. Theo, God, philo, love. So it's also possible that, since there aren't capitalizations in Greek, sometimes there are names that are either a proper name or it's just like a nickname or like a way to refer to somebody. So a lover of God could be any Christian.
Yeah.
So it's also possible that that's supposed to be just, hey, you, whoever you are, and that he didn't actually write it to anyone in particular. But what we know is why he wrote it. He wrote it so that people who were being educated in the gospel by the church could be certain that what the people in their church were telling them was what actually happened.
Yeah. Which way would you lean towards in terms of it being kind of a generalized God lover or person?
I think that it's probably a person. I think it's just the guy who was able to pay for him to write the gospel, because he also addresses Acts to Theophilus. It's the only other time that Theophilus is mentioned. And I think the evidence seems to indicate it was a rich patron.
Oh, nice. So my next question, and don't forget, you guys can ask questions in the comment section if you would like to, and Pastor Matt would be happy to answer those. But my next question kind of comes from the area of, just seeing how society handles the Bible sometimes. And so I just want to know, why do you think the Bible is so heavily scrutinized just in today's society compared to other possibly oral traditions, but also written works from the same time period that don't even have as many copies as the Bible does?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. First of all, I have a graph or a graphic that will demonstrate what you just said. So let me pull this up. This is a very handy graphic that I found. That's a blank page. There we go. Okay, so this is this is a graph that shows you two things. First of all, there's a series of dots. Each dot represents it represents a different ancient author whose works we have. And the distance they are from the center of those circles is how close to, that's the distance we have from the event that happened to when they wrote the document about it. So you'll notice that the closer they are to the center, the less time passed before they wrote the story. So I mentioned Thucydides, his history of the Peloponnesian War. You'll see him just upright of the center, and it's a small dot. It's relatively close, but you'll notice that none of these are closer than the red dot, which is the red circle, which is the New Testament. Now, the other thing that this shows you is the bigger the dot, the more copies of that document we have. So you'll notice that we have a few writings of Caesar. Julius Caesar wrote some, the history of the Gallic War and some famous stuff, and he's actually pretty far from that circle, from the center of that circle, and it's a pretty small circle, and yet nobody doubts the history of Caesar's life. Plato, nobody's really fighting over the accuracy of the manuscripts for Plato's writings, even though you can see those are really far away from when they were written, and we only have 210 copies of those manuscripts. Homer, we have 1,757 copies of those manuscripts, and the oldest ones are still pretty old. So some of these works, these are things that were written in 500 years before Jesus, and the oldest copy we can find was written 1,500 years after him. Mm-hmm. That's what a lot of these are like. When you look at the New Testament, you can see we have so many copies of the New Testament, it's ridiculous. It is the most copied, with the possible exception of the Old Testament, most copied set of ancient manuscripts ever. And we have really, really old versions of them. Mm-hmm. In fact, the more we study, the more we excavate, the older copies we find. It's amazing. We actually have copies of fragments of Mark that are from within 100 years of Jesus' life. Mm. It's crazy. And yet there is more skepticism about what the Gospels say than any other historical document. And I think the reason is because of what they claim. Mm. Because if they're right, then Jesus is king and we have to follow him. That's something we're actually going to talk about in this upcoming sermon about if you accept who Jesus is, you have to respond. Yeah. And so I think that's the reason why people are so skeptical about these documents, is because there is so much at stake. Mm-hmm. And so people will find reasons to disagree with or to reject things that they don't want to accept.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things I think about some of these gospel accounts is, in the grand scheme of things, they really weren't written that far after the events that they're talking about. Right. And you think about any type of memoir or something like that, where someone's writing maybe about events that have happened to them or they've seen in the past. They don't write that as they're really happening. They kind of reflect on those things, I feel. And that seems like what was kind of happening with the Gospels.
Yeah. So for us, it seems like 30 years is probably 30 years after the resurrection is probably when Mark was written, about 30 to 40. And for us, that seems like a long time. Mm-hmm. But the first biography of Julius Caesar was written 300 years after he died. The very first. Mm-hmm. That's ridiculous. Yeah. And yet, again, we don't doubt the life story of Julius Caesar. Yeah.
Well, one thing maybe to kind of compare what that is,
I'm sorry, that was... No, I didn't mind. Sorry, keep going.
But with the pandemic happening right now, this is a significant historical event But I doubt you'd see people writing whole memoirs of their life and the pandemic that happened right now, like immediately after it happened. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people that end up writing about it 30 years or 40 years from now. Because I wouldn't plan on writing a book within 30 or 40 years from like right now. So
well, a lot of people have already written about what it's like in the pandemic, but we aren't even out of it yet. And so the stuff that's going to endure will be the things that have the perspective from after it's over.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. So next question. You kind of brought up this idea of oral traditions, and the Jewish society was very heavily an oral tradition, I feel.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to ask, when did this start to shift from being, when did oral tradition start to shift to being kind of recorded on documents like scrolls or things like that? When did that shift kind of start to happen?
Do you mean in the history of the New Testament or in world history?
Let's say world history.
Really, I think it was probably when printing, probably at the invention of the printing press in the 1500s is when it really would have changed. Because having the ability to write doesn't mean you're not going to have oral history. Because writing was incredibly expensive. In most cultures, you had to hire someone who knew how to write. You had to pay for really expensive materials in order for them to write it down. And so you just didn't do it very much. And it wasn't until and then when you did, you couldn't spread it around very much. It was like it would be easier to tell something to 10 people and have them go out and tell people than to write it 10 times. And so that's like the 1500s that we really started to get away from primarily an oral tradition or an oral community. And we can't even fathom that now, because now everything is written down. We even will say things, and then our computers, I think you can turn on closed captioning of this video that you're watching right now. You could read this if you wanted to. It's just very different from us.
So with that being the case, then with the New Testament, how do we get so many of those early copies then? Well, I think it was in the 1500s, the amount of New Testament copies in Greek. What types of copies would they have been making then?
So the reason why they started making copies is there's a difference between oral. Okay, so we were an oral culture in terms of we mainly told stories and preserved stories orally for a very long time. Then there's oral tradition. Oral tradition is a story that has been handed down for hundreds of years, like the Iliad and the Odyssey. Those are poems by Homer. Those were probably handed down for hundreds of years and worked on and changed before they were written down. Those are oral traditions. The New Testament is not an oral tradition. It's an oral history, which means that it wasn't handed down for hundreds of years before it was written down. It was written down while the people who saw it were still alive. And that's different. And the reason why it was written down was so that it would be history rather than tradition. And actually the timing of the Gospels being written coincides with the time when the eyewitnesses were starting to die off quickly. They were getting older, persecution was getting fiercer, the wars were breaking out between Rome and the Jews. It was right when things were really destabilizing, and the writings or the eyewitness testimony needed to be preserved. That's why they waited, because they didn't need it in the first 30 years. They had the eyewitnesses. And so once they had those written down, those direct eyewitnesses were worth preserving. And those are the kinds of things that you did write down. Things that were just life-changing, world-changing, or involved tax revenue. That tended to be what you wrote down.
Well, that just kind of builds the case for how solid the Bible is anyway, with different stories they were oral tradition for a few hundred years, and then someone wrote it down. Things could be changed within that 300 years so much, but with the Bible, it being written down as the eyewitnesses are talking about it, that just kind of builds confidence.
Absolutely.
So my next question, and don't forget you guys can comment questions if you have them, but my next question kind of takes it to the Old Testament. And so I'm just curious, that was an oral kind of history there, that was passed down a lot. Who and when did they decide to actually write that down, the Old Testament? Was that during the same time, or was that after or before when it was actually written down?
The Old Testament, the writing of the Old Testament is a fascinating and very long story that I probably shouldn't tell in all its detail. We talk about this in the Bible training class that we do here sometimes. It's a long process. It starts with things being written down, it probably starts with Moses. And Moses wrote things down, but what he probably did was he probably wrote a lot of things that were then collected together. So he wrote down laws, and he probably wrote down his history in other places. And there's actually also evidence that the stories from Genesis have been handed down to him. Noah's name is a pun, but it actually doesn't work as well in Hebrew as it does in Akkadian, which is an older language, which tells us that the story is probably older than that, which means it was handed down by the Hebrews and handed down to Moses. So Moses probably wrote all of that stuff down. David probably wrote his Psalms on different pieces of paper. Solomon would have had, and then Solomon would have written his Proverbs. But in Jerusalem, they probably would have been collecting these things, and they would have had a library, and they would have been written down immediately. Like when Moses got it, he wrote it down, handed all these things down. And then the prophets were also writing. They were prolific writers, and they actually had kind of monasteries that would preserve their writings and compile them. And then what happened was the Jerusalem was destroyed, and the temple was destroyed, and the Israelites were sent out all over the known world, and they needed some way to carry their heritage with them. And that seems to be when some nameless scribes went through all these records and stitched them together into books that could be copied and sent out around the world. And so the writings of Moses didn't write the 5 books of Moses. He wrote the material that someone else then stitched together to make the 5 books of Moses. It doesn't mean that the material didn't come from him, but it's kind of like the way the Gospels were written, where they put together eyewitness accounts. Somebody took all the things that Moses wrote and put it together. And the same thing with the histories. They probably, and the thing is, the Old Testament acknowledges this throughout. And when you read the books of Moses, it makes multiple references to the books that Moses was writing at the time, which are different from the 5 books of Moses. There's the Book of the Covenant, the Book of the Wars of the Lord, different things like that. And then in the Kings and Chronicles, it will also say, if you want to know more about this, go read the Chronicles. Go read the records of this person. And what that's saying is, this is the source where we got that material. After people were sent out in the exile, that's when they started to form a Bible. And they started to form collections of books. And they added a few on that were written during the exile. And then it seems to have reached its final format. Well, I should say it actually reached its final format about 100 years after the resurrection, when the Jews finally got together and decided which ones were going to be in the Old Testament. And they decided it would only be the books that were written in Hebrew. And so they cut some off that they had been using but had never been officially declared scripture. They would have been written in Greek. But the Christians had already been using those, which is why Catholic Bibles and Orthodox Bibles have more books in the Old Testament. Because those were handed down before the Jews settled their canon.
That's actually a really good segue into my next question. So the content of the Gospels, right? You know, we kind of know what's in there. I mean, it's about Jesus' life and it's eyewitness testimonies to his life. Are these the only 4 books that kind of have this type of content, or is there other content out there? And if so, why isn't it included in the Bible?
So this is something that people will talk about a lot. They call it the New Testament Apocrypha. So Apocrypha is the word that we use to describe the Old Testament books that were cut out. So they had been part of the collection, and then when the Jews went to decide which ones were actually inspired, they took those out. Okay, we use the same word sometimes to describe New Testament book, or not New Testament books, but books about Christianity that claim to be Scripture. There are a lot of other Gospels: the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Acts of Peter, all these different books that are imitations of New Testament books. And people will say that, they took these out of the Bible, or they cut them out of the New Testament, or they kept them away. And that's not what happened. So every indication we have is that the four Gospels have been recognized as authentic, as reliable by the church from the very beginning. And all the churches did this independently. There wasn't a council that made rules for everybody. It's just each church would manage their own library, and they all knew these four actually came from eyewitness accounts. The other Gospels start to appear in about 200 to 300 years later, and they all have a couple of things in common. They are all written by people who are mentioned in the other Gospels but don't do very much. So it tends to be Thomas, Judas, Mary Magdalene, people like that. And then the other thing is they all tend to have different approaches to the gospel. They're Gnostics, which is basically this approach that says that the physical world is bad, and Jesus actually, he wasn't really incarnated. He just appeared, and he came to teach us a secret way to leave our bodies behind. And Gnosticism is actually something that kind of recurs in Christian traditions, and there's Gnosticism in our cultures now today too. But they all seem to have that perspective. They're called Gnostic Gospels. And so what they did was, in order to justify these new theologies, they said, oh, well, let's find a New Testament figure who didn't write anything, and we'll claim that we found something he wrote. And so nobody was fooled by this. Only the people who believed those things, only the Gnostics actually ever really used them, and we don't even really know if they thought they were authentic or if they knew they were kind of forgeries. But they were never part of the Bible. No one ever suggested putting them in the Bible. They were never considered. They were never removed. By the time they were written, the gospel, the church canon, the list of books had been pretty much settled for 100 years or more. And so the idea that they were taken out of the Bible or rejected for the Bible is ridiculous. It would be like if I wrote a book now about Jesus and then said people were keeping it out of the Bible. No, the Bible isn't open for new books. It's closed, especially if you make it up later.
Yeah.
So that's my little soapbox.
Yeah. If you haven't noticed already, this is a very content heavy deleted scenes.
I've read a lot about this stuff, and I get passionate about it because there's a lot of misinformation.
It's a really, there's a lot of different fun topics within this whole thing, and I took a class this last spring as part of my senior year called Origin and Nature of the Bible, where we talked a lot about this stuff and read through it. It was actually one of the classes that I did online fully. So in the pandemic, in quarantine at my home. So anyway.
I meant to bring them in and I didn't. I have books that are just all like the Old Testament Apocrypha, and then there's the Pseudepigrapha, which would actually be a better name for the stuff in the New Testament, which is all these basically everything we have that's written that's claiming to be from a biblical source. And I have the Infancy Gospel of Thomas in there. I was actually thinking about quoting it in this coming sermon when we're talking about the brothers of Jesus, because it talks about Jesus' childhood, but it's ridiculous. It's hilarious what happens in there. The first thing that happens is Jesus is out playing in a stream, and he starts making birds out of clay, but the kids, the townspeople get mad at him because it's Sabbath, so he claps his hands and tells them to fly away, and they fly away. And he's 5 years old at this point. And then the next day, he's in town, and a kid runs by and knocks him over, and Jesus strikes him dead. And the town gets really angry, so Jesus strikes them blind. So Joseph grabs him by the ear and tries to discipline him, and Jesus says, "Don't you know I don't belong to you?"
Oh my!
It's like a worst case scenario.
It sounds like one of those satire type films that they'd make about Jesus. You know?
There's another gospel when they said that Jesus didn't actually have a body, that made the crucifixion a problem. So what they said was that Jesus traded places with Simon of Cyrene, the guy who carried the cross, and made him look like Jesus. And so they crucified Simon of Cyrene while Jesus stood on a hill, the next hill over, and laughed. Which is interesting because Simon of Cyrene is one of those that we have a pretty strong indication that he was an eyewitness who told his story to the gospel writers. And that's why we know the name of his sons.
All right.
So we may get into that later.
See, one of the things I remember talking about, though, is that with these Gnostic Gospels, What you find in the four Gospels that are in the New Testament that are recognized as part of the biblical canon, right? They are different, but they never go against each other. They're never contrary to each other. But there were several things in these Gnostic Gospels that were completely contrary to what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually say, and I think that's one of the key indicators as to how these are Gnostic Gospels and aren't included and were kind of forgeries in a way. So
the other big indicator is that the Gospels spend an inordinate amount of time focusing on the last week of Jesus' life. Like almost half of them is about the Holy Week, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. Gnostic Gospels, for them, the crucifixion is an embarrassment. It doesn't really fit in their theology. So Gnostic Gospels do a lot of mystical preaching and avoid the crucifixion as much as they possibly can, which you would think that would be the other way around if Jesus didn't rise from the dead. It would be a bigger embarrassment when people still remembered that Jesus hadn't risen from the dead, right? If there were eyewitnesses that could say that he never came back to life, that would be when you kind of avoid the topic. And later, after generations later, that's when you could start saying, well, maybe he just came back to life again.
Yeah.
But that's not how it works.
Yeah. What we're finding out about this deleted scenes is when you get two pastors in a room together that have both studied a certain topic, you get really long conversations about that topic. So, So next question is kind of more of maybe a little bit of a simple question. Why can the church today trust these eyewitness testimonies and trust the Bible? I think we've kind of talked a lot about why we can, but maybe you could just kind of focus our eyes on that a little bit.
Well, the one thing I want to add to what we've said is simply that trust is a necessary part of knowledge. What some people will want to think is that, well, I would rather trust I don't want to trust in anyone. I want to believe what I see. And the fact is that nobody goes their life without trusting sources. Trust is required for knowledge. You trust someone that they fixed your car. You trust the tools that you use to do scientific measurements. You trust in the word of your doctor. Like medicine wouldn't work if we didn't trust people to know more than we do. Right? Like when they said that our daughter was inverted before she was born, I had to take their word for it. I don't have a way to find that out for myself. Yeah. So for me to require, and even if they showed me the evidence, I wouldn't know how to interpret it. So trust is the only way we can go through our lives, and the Gospels are proven to be trustworthy. And so we have to contend with that. We have to face the fact that these are the most trustworthy ancient historical documents we have.
Yeah. So next question is kind of more of, I wouldn't say maybe a theological question, but kind of more of talking to less about the facts and figures and more to a little bit more about, the kind of different stuff. I'm having trouble thinking of the word, but anyway, I just want to ask, what is more important, experience or scripture? What we experience to be true or what we read in the Bible? Because one of the things that you brought up in the sermon is this idea that we are tasked with bringing the gospel to people, and that the Bible is capable of speaking on its own. If someone finds it in a hotel room, if it's placed in the right place at the right time. But how much more is it? Is it a different playing field, or is it an even keel as to the importance of the experience people have with conversations with us and with Jesus and different things like that, or with Scripture?
I think they're equally important. I think they play different roles, and we see that in Luke's introduction. Luke says, I'm giving you this so that you'll be certain of what you've been taught. Not so that you won't have to be taught, not so you won't have to go to church, but so that you will have certainty in what you're being taught. I think that being involved in the life of the church is essential. Having experience of God is essential. If all we know is the book, it does us no good. There are a lot of atheists and skeptics who know the book better than most Christians, and it clearly does not give them a robust relationship with God, right? And so it's not just knowing the book. We have to have that living relationship with God. But if we don't have the book, that we have a tendency to fool ourselves into taking our relationship with God in weird ways that are not actually connected with Him. And so I think they're two things that play important connected roles.
All right, so my final question that is on topic and not completely random. Don't forget, you can ask any question you might have here in the closing stages. But this last one is kind of focused on the idea of testimonies, because you focused a lot on that and the importance of testimonies. Hence the eyewitness idea, and so I just want to ask, what if I feel like my testimony isn't very significant or good? Maybe, I have grown up in the church and that's all I've ever known and nothing really crazy has happened to me, and I just feel like my testimony isn't all that phenomenal or special in a way.
I would say that I think there's two things that can make a testimony powerful. There is the uniqueness of the story, which is what we tend to think of. Like, I need a crazy story, like God saved me from drug use, and like I was dead for 2 minutes and I saw a vision of hell, and now we want something big and dramatic, and that can be powerful. There are a lot of powerful stories in the New Testament. But I think the other thing that gives testimony power is our familiarity with the person who's testifying. So it's possible that you have a very normal, mundane, unexciting testimony, but there will be people who know you and trust you, for whom your mundane testimony will be way more valuable than a stranger's extreme testimony. And so the better, that's why relationship building is so important as we try to bring people to Christ, is that they have to have a reason to believe us. And so I think that that's what we do, is we build relationship, and the better someone knows you and the more they trust you, the more meaningful your testimony is going to be. And it doesn't have to be something crazy. You could just say, hey, you know me, you know the kind of person I am. I'm this kind of person because of Jesus. And hopefully that's a credit to Jesus.
Yeah, right.
That's why I hesitate to use that, make it that simple myself. I try to be clear. I don't know how good I am, but I'm better than I was.
Yeah.
And that's because of Jesus.
I didn't just say, yeah, because I knew you before. Yeah, he is better because of Jesus now. I didn't know Matt before, so I've only ever known Matt since he was pastor, youth pastor, whatever you want to call it. So, all right, so I have one last completely off topic and random question. So this is your time to get your final questions shot into the comment section. And so my last question for you, what do you find in your life gives you the most nostalgia? And so, for example, I'd say when I hear the sound of a PlayStation 2 starting up, I am brought back to my childhood because I played that thing a lot, specifically Gran Turismo 4. And so when I see a cover of that gives me the most nostalgia ever. So video games, old sports events too. So those are kind of my examples. So what gives you the most nostalgia?
Man, that's a tough question to just come off the top of my head. What is... Books tend to be a big part of my nostalgia because they were a big part of my growing up. I haven't seen one in a while, but if I ever were to see a World Book Encyclopedia, I think that would take me right back. This is a funny story about me when I was in elementary school, when I was in kindergarten. I was learning the alphabet, and we had a World Book Encyclopedia, and I was looking through the JK edition, and I found the article on Jesus. So I stood up and I yelled, Mrs. Calstead, I found Jesus. And she came up, and from what I don't remember this, but from what I'm told, she said something to the effect of, Matthew, some people spend their entire lives trying to find Jesus.
All right.
I loved looking through encyclopedias. My brothers teased me about it a lot. And now I feel justified because of how many people will spend hours on Wikipedia. Mm-hmm. Now they know why I was doing that, because it's fascinating to just go from subject to subject.
I love Wikipedia.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite things in the world. Well, cool. There hasn't been any questions added, so I guess that concludes our time. We are so grateful that you spent it with us this afternoon. We will be back in the same spot, the same time, next week in Studio A. So that's what we're calling it.
Yep, Studio A.
Studio
I like
A.
It. It's going to stick.
So, this was a fun one. I enjoyed it. I love this content, and thanks for joining us. Pastor Matt, do you want to sign off for us?
Absolutely. Stay healthy, stay hopeful, and go in peace to love and serve the Lord. See you next week.